McQueen, and I'm the Executive Director of Medicinal Mindfulness. And before I introduce Rick, I'd like to provide a little context to this gathering to create the right set and setting for this event. Medicinal Mindfulness began in 2012 with our sister organization, Aspen Roots Counseling, to provide psychedelic harm reduction services to the local Boulder area community. And it has evolved into something much more since then, though. And while we're technically a business in the legal sense, we're not a nonprofit. And what that means is all our income comes from the people we support. And that, to me, really keeps me honest, keeps our community honest in the work we do. But where our vision and our intention is more like an expedition voyage. And unlike the sailing ships of other eras and the spaceships of today, we're explorers of possibilities. And medicinal mindfulness, what we're bringing back on these voyages is the fruits and the seeds of that is what we're sharing with our community. We ask ourselves, what would it look like to start living into a psychedelic-inspired today instead of trying to live into a psychedelic-inspired future? And that's a big shift. And this is my Naropa training coming out again, this present-centered approach. We commend all of the individuals and communities and organizations that are supporting this work to re-legalize these sacred medicines in the world. But we're doing a little different. Our intention has been we've decided to see what we could already live into regarding intentional medicine use today that was within the current legal constraints of our society. And in doing so, maybe hone the skill sets that would be required for a larger, healthier, vibrant, psychedelic community. Medicinal mindfulness represents the seeds of our expeditions, new ideas, skills, and experiences that we're bringing back to share with you all. And we started by teaching classes on psychedelic harm reduction and psychedelic safety. And then an amazing thing happened, and recreational cannabis was legalized in Colorado. And since 2014, we've been facilitating intentional psychedelic journeys using cannabis, and hundreds of participants have gone through these experiences with us. And more often than not, the experiences themselves are described as very DMT-like. So I want to pause here. There's many of you are thinking that I'm exaggerating, and I'm not. And that's the power of what we're discovering with this work. So cannabis has the ability to mimic all of the other classic psychedelics. It's amazing. And if you check out the program for today, you'll see a list of the events and gatherings that we're planning for this summer. We're calling it our Psychedelic Summer, and you're invited to explore our community. And this is just a glimpse of what we do, a small glimpse. Conscious Cannabis Circles, Medicine Song Community, Breathwork, Psychedelic Sitters School, and our new program, Cannabis Healing Circles for medicinal patients. Our community has also sponsored Native American church peyote ceremonies. I don't know if y'all saw Chris Long speak in March at our Psychedelic Shine. And we're going to Sonic Bloom and Arise Music Festival this year to help participants who might be experiencing psychedelic crises. So we have 20 plus people go on to these festivals. We have 70 people on our sitters list, and so we have a really big organization and community around this work. So we are living a psychedelic future right now here in Colorado, and we don't have to wait for the legalization of the next medicine to begin experiencing what a psychedelic society will be like. We can do this today. I am very curious what would happen if a lot of other people started doing this. And we were so excited about what we were doing that we wanted to share, but we wanted to keep it in alignment with the vision and intention that we were creating. And that means not really like going out and telling the world, but telling the people that we wanted to connect with. So that meant putting like some sort of beacon out in the world. And that's where Psychedelic Shine came in. We created Psychedelic Shine to highlight, support, and promote not just the potential of psychedelics for our future, but also to celebrate the successes of psychedelics already alive today. And these are community gatherings as much as they are a speaker series. And this was our gift to our local community. It's our gift to you all, to provide a safe context for you all to really get that you are not alone. You are not alone in your interest in this sacred work. Look at this, right? And this is our 5th Psychedelic Shine. And we've hosted topics on MDMA, peyote, cannabis, and now DMT. And we've asked our speakers to each present on the same topic, exact same topic, by suggesting the following. Given what you know about or have experience with psychedelics, what are you called to share with the world? We wanted to see what might come from that. And so this leads us to Dr. Strassman and DMT. Dr. Rick Strassman is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and president and co-founder of the Cottonwood Research Foundation. He is visiting us from Gallup, New Mexico. On November 19, 1990, Dr. Strassman reignited the flame of psychedelic research in this country that was forcefully extinguished nearly 2 decades earlier. And from 1990 to 1995, Dr. Strassman conducted over 400 sessions with the powerful naturally occurring compound N,N-dimethyltryptamine on 60 volunteers. And he wrote a seminal text called DMT, the Spirit Molecule. This is a book that has inspired countless psychonauts, myself included. And I want to remind our younger activists here, researchers and healers in the room, that Dr. Strassman was 38 years old when he started this research. So I thought I just asked him about that to double check the age, and I'm 38 now too. So this is interesting synchronicity. In addition to DMT, the Spirit Molecule, Dr. Strassman is the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy and co-author of Inner Paths to Outer Space. And there was something special about Dr. Strassman's first book that so many of us were drawn to. And from my experience in working with my clients, this book was often the first book purchased by curious adventurers beginning to wander into the deep waters of psychedelic exploration. There's something about it that drew our attention. In his chapter, Preparations for the Journey in Inner Paths to Outer Space, is the most well-written discussion on preparing for the psychedelic experience I have found, and it's required reading in our psychedelic sitter school. And lastly, I think I can sum up his journey through DMT and the Soul of Prophecy from an email a friend of mine wrote, an ayahuasca practitioner. This is think of a dry humor here. Hi, Daniel. I see you have Strassman coming. Interesting guy. Gone mystic in a big way recently. I suspect Dr. Strassman has been a mystic for some time. It was pretty evident in reading his last book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, that Dr. Strassman began living into the possibility of conducting psychedelic research well before it was possible for him to do so. It had been shut down 20 years prior. Dr. Strassman reignited this flame anyway. I find that fact most inspiring. I shared a little background about medicinal mindfulness and psychedelic shine to create the right set and setting for this afternoon, and hopefully to inspire you. Our work began before we knew it was possible for our work to begin, if that makes any sense, right? And Dr. Strassman was the inspiration for this. He began to lay the foundations for his psychedelic research before he knew it was possible to do so. And it was this work that gave him the necessary experience and skill sets to be successful when his psychedelic research began. This is a step that many in our community try to skip, is the foundational experiences that we need to have to really embody the big steps that we're taking. Like, we didn't start with an event this size, for example. There is a fire that fills many of our hearts and bellies with passion for this work. And it is spreading through our culture fast and with deliberate intention. It is this fire that brought many of you here today, whether you know it or not, that curiosity of something that transcends this space, but also fills it. And this fire was reignited by Dr. Strassman in his work with DMT. And for that, I can't thank him enough. And please welcome Dr. Rick Strassman.
Welcome back. Thank you. That's me. Well, so Daniel started to discuss this event with me a few months back, and I was, thinking that the whole concept of the Shine events was a great one, and I, told him I'd be interested in helping out however I could. So I'm really glad to be here. And and by the size of this crowd, it seems like things are really taking off up here. So I want to give thanks to Daniel, Kevin, Molly, and everybody, and to Kimba for the opening music. That was great. Want to thank the Shine Restaurant, Gathering Place, the Boulderado Hotel for sponsoring this, and the Best Western Plus for putting me up. So instead of talking about DMT, what's DMT, what plants is it found in, what receptors does it activate, what is the DMT experience like, in thinking about this talk and discussing it with Daniel, I was thinking I would make it a bit more personal. The way I got to be what I'm doing now, the way I got to be doing that work previously. So a few months ago, I stumbled upon a pile of old photographs from my childhood, and they just seemed to hit the spot in a lot of ways. So for the first time, I'll be giving a talk with baby photos. One of the things that struck me looking at these black and white pictures of me at 6 months old is that's who I was, that's who I am. And I started thinking about this whole concept of temperament. It's pretty much laid down, and you can tell an infant's temperament at 2 days, 3 days. The temperament of one kid will be clearly different than the temperament of another kid, and you can distinguish that at quite an early age. But I think it's more complicated than purely temperament. It isn't that you're cranky or relaxed or you're inquisitive or you're introverted. I think things are just kind of they're kind of laid down in a embryonic form, and those constraints are what then defines you for the rest of your life. The constraints and the strengths and the weaknesses, but you'll be a certain height, you'll have a certain intellectual capacity, and after that you just start to interact with your environment. Early on, you just kind of mimic what you see. That's what primates do, is they mimic, and you're stuck or you're gifted with mimicking whoever happens to be in your space at the time. Your parents, your friends, your family. And at a certain point, you start to be able to make conscious decisions and take responsibility. And so it began to appear as if it's just, you begin with a potential, which is genetic and intrauterine, and you're born. And then you start to just kind of spiral increasingly through time and space with those capacities. So one of the things I think that you're born with is what attracts you, what really draws your attention. And that kind of summarizes what attracted me. I was 6 months old, and I perceived something that was in front of me. It wasn't in me. It was outside of me. Obviously, I'm looking someplace else, but it's invisible at the same time. Like who knows what I'm looking at? But it completely drew me in, and I'm flying. I have my arms behind me. It's a great cobra pose. I'm just straining all of my muscles to attend to whatever it is that I'm seeing, and God only knows what I was seeing. But I, clearly recognized it. Like this was it. Like okay, this is it. And it required energy to apprehend, to grasp, fully. I think as I began to, be able to, think about things, the specific, contents that feeling kind of manifested in were in dreams and the wind. I loved the wind as a small child, and fireworks. I really liked fireworks, and I even went to college thinking I would be a chemistry major and be a fireworks magnate. But I was discouraged. I got the last laugh though. Okay. Well, it's important to determine, figure out, recognize what attracts you, and that kind of stuck out in that photograph there. So you have to keep your eye on the ball too, because the ball gets hidden from all kinds of conditioning, people discouraging you or encouraging you. Like I have changed, fields quite often. Became a chemistry major, a biology major, wanted to be a psychology grad student, then I decided to be a doctor because I wanted to do psychedelic research. And it's, some people have wondered, about how come I just can't stick to one thing. But it's not really true. I've been sticking to one thing. I've been pursuing that, vision, whatever it, whatever form it, takes at the time. So here's me keeping my eye on the ball. You need to maintain a healthy skepticism too. Like if you think that you've figured it out or you've gotten it or it all makes sense now. One of the interesting phrases from Dogen, who brought Zen from China to Japan, is that one always should be disturbed by the truth. So when you start to feel complacent or you've got it worked out, that's usually when things get to be you become conservative. And so that's me being skeptical. Like, are you really sure? These are great photos, eh? Yeah, thank goodness for parents. Okay, so, and you need to be, persistent too. You just can't take no for an answer. Well, you can take no for an answer. You've got to take no for an answer. But if people don't really say no, then that could be your opening to them ultimately, saying yes. Well, like for example, I spent 2 years, calling DEA, calling FDA, back in the '80s, and they never really, frankly, said no. So I just figured I would keep at it until they said no or they said yes. So after those 2 years, it paid off. So here's me being persistent. I think I'm 11 at that point. But notice the tie. I'll be returning to that. So school. School is, really critical. Well, I was at Stanford doing some embryology research when I was 20, and I looked out the window one day in July. The sun was going down, and it just hit me. I'm going to do psychedelic drug research. This is 1972. And I just, got into school and just kept at it. I just kept on getting, so much training that I was so overtrained that by the time I, decided to begin applying to get the work started, I could speak the language. I understood the concerns. I was able to design an adequate study that didn't really, ruffle too many feathers. So school and more school. Quite a few high school kids email me, even some kids from junior high, and they say, "Oh, I want to do what you do," or did. And I just tell them, school. Just get into the best school you can, then continue in graduate school, or continue with medical school. Become a psychiatrist if you want to study humans. Then get research training. Then get analyzed by a good psychoanalyst. Then find a good spiritual teacher that you can train under. So it's just training. So I started when I was 20, and I gave my first dose of DMT almost 20 years later, like 18 years later. But it's kind of like Daniel was speaking about it. You just don't jump into it. You really have to do the groundwork, especially if it's controversial or goes against the grain. And in school, you get the skills, you get mentors, you get colleagues, and you find out about jobs. Okay. So this is school. This is me as a medical student back in the Bronx. 7 a.m. or 6:45 or something. I didn't really care. What I looked like. I was just going to school. I still have that jacket. But I don't wear it. Okay. Well, it's important to ask for help too. Somehow I was, kind of, gifted with, the ability to, realize when I needed help. Well, like any kind of help. So that took the, form of, finding colleagues, finding mentors, psychological help and spiritual help. So there's me asking for help. Hey. Yeah, so it kind of, began with school, kind of general advice. And I was at Stanford and got to know, Jim Fadiman. So Jim told me about the pineal gland. He said, like I was 19 walking into his office, and he said, "Have you ever heard of the pineal gland?" I said no, and I, wrote it down. How do you spell that? So that was quite helpful. And also Jim, told me about Shasta Abbey, which is a Zen monastery up in Northern California. So the two most important things that I kind of began getting involved in my 20s were a result of Jim, kind of taking me under his wing. So Danny Friedman was a psychiatrist at Yale, NIMH, Chicago, UCLA. So Danny was critical in me getting my permits and grants. I got to know him. He liked me. He figured, he could kind of, shape my career, shape the kind of, research, that he wanted to, see, begin the, renaissance in American studies. So some strategic phone calls, some strategically written, notes in the margin of letters. So he was really quite important. So I got analyzed. I went through a Freudian analysis, 4 years, 5 days a week. And, Dave Metcalf was my analyst in Albuquerque. And, I couldn't find a picture of him, which is kind of apropos because I never saw him because he was always sitting behind me. Well, I mean over there. Yeah, but that was key. I didn't really know if I could do this. Can I do this research? I mean, this is crazy. And, as most analysts, do, he didn't really say anything. And I took that as implicit encouragement, and it continued. Well, so Dave Nichols, made the DMT for a song for $300. This was, 1989. So Dave at the time was at Purdue. He's currently in North Carolina. So Glenn Peake and Cliff Qualls were at UNM, and Glenn Peake was a pediatric neuroendocrinologist, and I was interviewing to work at UNM, and he said, "Oh, you're interested in the pineal, you're interested in melatonin." He said, "Come and work for us." So as a pediatric neuroendocrinologist, there's all kinds of issues regarding the development of puberty with melatonin in humans and in lower animals. So he was interested in, from that point of view, and encouraged me, and I got a grant to, work under him. And Clifford Qualls was our statistician, who I spent hundreds of hours with analyzing our data, especially the rating scale, which has been used for a lot of different drugs around the world, still being used quite frequently, to kind of, quantify the psychedelic drug state. And spiritual teachers, I trained under the supervision of Kenneth Roshi up at Shasta Abbey. I started to study under the supervision of their group when I was 22, and spent 20 plus years studying, practicing, being supervised by them. And I've got a rabbi that I turn to when I have, questions about the Bible, understanding, what it's, what it's actually saying. So he's in New York and Israel. Go figure. Okay. So one other hint, speaking of that tie, is to look normal. I started cutting my hair when I was 20, and everybody asked me if I was gay because I had short hair. I said, no, I just like short hair. But I could be kind of unobtrusive when I looked straight, with, short hair. I threw my tie-dye away my junior year. I've got a really funky picture of me with a really scraggy beard and long hair and big thick glasses, and I was thinking I would include it, but I don't want that picture anywhere. And there's nothing is private anymore. So here's me looking normal. Well, so my mom used to dress me. So I guess most moms do. Yeah, and she taught me how to look straight. It's important to share. I've been through a lot. I've learned a lot. I've had a lot of cool experiences. So I think if you are gifted with those kinds of things, it's your obligation to share. You need to interact creatively with your environment, and one of the ways is by sharing. There's me sharing. Keep your sense of humor. If you're really going to be swimming against the tide, you need to, have friends and be able to, joke around. One of the, things that is good about, medical training is you really develop a great sense of black humor. And once you are going to be doing, something that might take a lot of rejection and hard work, that can really come in handy. So here's me being cool and happy. Okay, it's important to check in every year or so and see what's going on. Like, are things going the way that you want them to? And if not, if you're getting bored or you feel like you're getting constrained, in my case anyway, that's usually an indication that I'm gathering dust and it's time to kind of hone in more carefully and closely on that original feeling. So, are we having fun yet? Well, okay. So the personal stuff. The sum of the matter is find out what really pulls you in, and then recognize it. Whenever and wherever or however it occurs, and pursue it relentlessly, and keep your head, and share. And so that's the feeling that I was pursuing, have been pursuing actually. Okay, so the more academic or the more conceptual. Sharing. Develop a team. That was one thing I was kind of, weak in, and maybe I'd be still doing psychedelic research if I had a better team. But I was never that, great at convening a team and collaborating. So, that's just one of the, things that, worked out the way it did. But, I think that relates to the whole issue of your temperament. Like, are you a team player or are you not? I was a great, team player if I was the captain. But otherwise, it didn't really work out that well. So that may have been, part of, the, constitution that I was born with. But if you can, I think, if you've got a good team, you can collaborate with people that are your peers that support each other. I think that's key. Okay, so there's just three, talking points that I'm interested in covering. I was up here last, summer, and I gave my long talk about, the prophetic state and God and the Bible, and that's just a little too much, I think, if you're not, really into it. But I think the more overarching, questions are important, to address. So one of them is the nomenclature. What do you call the psychedelics? And one of the things I've been keen on for the last few years is making certain that people use the word psychedelic. because I think it's the most, generic, the most all-encompassing. Psychedelic means, disclosing the mind or, manifesting the mind. And I think it, captures the, fact that, sometimes nothing happens on a psychedelic, drug state or trip. Or one thing may happen, or just a couple of things may happen. You might be happy, you might be sad. You might see things you might not. You might be out of your body, you might not be. So I think it's a more generic term, which is the most useful. Other people use, terms, for the medical, literature, calling them, the hallucinogens. But that's too restrictive, and it also kind of bespeaks, the unreality of what one is experiencing. And also a more, contemporary term is to call them entheogens. But that assumes a, belief in spirituality, and some people don't have that. And it also is, calling the compounds, by the name of a specific kind of experience, which a lot of people don't have. Well, Richard Dawkins would never take an entheogen, right? But he would take a psychedelic, and he wouldn't take a psychotomimetic. I mean, who would want to take a psychotomimetic? But it's interesting. The Europeans are still using that term. They're still, calling LSD psilocybin psychotomimetics. Okay. For some liquid. Okay, so the other point that I'm interested in, belaboring is, the issue of, the ultimate goal of the, psychedelic, drug state. And in my current, book on the, describing the prophetic state, I, spend a lot of time, making the distinction between what I call the interactive relational state and the mystical unitive state. The mystical unitive state is, where there's no, self, there's no time, there's no space, there's no content. In, terms of, Buddhism, it's the experience of emptiness. And, people describe it as a, fulsome emptiness, but still, it's an emptiness. There is the, reconciliation of the opposites, and usually it's quite ecstatic, quite blissful. And it's, become by default the endpoint for therapy and, religious, even recreational use of, the higher doses of these drugs. Both, for the research and, for the non-research, setting. But I think that's, not the entire story. I think it's a, kind of artifact of the culture and the time in which this, research began. And I think that you need to keep in mind the whole concept of a, self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're coached and you're expecting and you're kind of hoping to have a unitive, mystical, white light, no self kind of state, and you're experiencing a state of consciousness which is extremely suggestible. There were some studies, back in the 1960s, combining LSD with hypnosis. It was called, hypnodelic therapy. So it was, recognized in the very beginning, that people experiencing these states were quite suggestible. So if you're a participant in a research study and you're coached to have that kind of experience, and if you're, told to respond to certain, difficulties in the state with interventions which are going to, lead one to a, unitive state, then it's kind of a no-brainer that, those are the kind of experiences which are going to be more common. There's this questionnaire, which is, one of the standards for, for psychedelic, research, is called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. So they ask, well, did you have an experience of unity? Was it ineffable? Could you describe it? Was the breakdown of opposites? And, if you're completely out there on LSD, psilocybin, DMT, you'll check, yeah. But, I don't think that's the entire story. If you ask people other questions, if those, and you were instructed to respond to specific elements of this state in a certain way, the experience would be different, and your scores on a different kind of rating scale would also be high. But it's been the default, which I think doesn't have to be the case. Well, so counter to the mystical unitive state is what I call the interactive relational one. There's the maintenance of the self, the maintenance of time and space, psychic space anyway. Content. There's a lot of content. It isn't empty. There's things. And you are in conflict with those things, or you're bargaining, or you're arguing, or you're pleading, or you're interacting. And it isn't necessarily blissful. It could be stressful. But still, it could be quite helpful. There is a Canadian psychiatrist whose name was Abram Hoffer, who was one of the fathers of LSD research in Canada. And there was a episode of the of a BBC television show called Horizons, which came out maybe 15, 20 years ago. And they speak with Dr. Hoffer, and he tells this great story. So most of his research was occurring in Canada, in Saskatoon, and they were treating alcoholics with these huge doses of LSD. Hoffer tells this story about this guy named John, who he gave a big dose of LSD to, and he spent the day with John. And John's very quiet, just sits there, and Dr. Hoffer checks in every couple hours. How's it going, John? He says fine. And afterwards, Dr. Hoffer comes up to him and says, well, what happened? And he said, I heard God say to me, John, stop drinking. And he never drank again. And that is a completely non-mystical unitive white light state. It's like, okay, you hear a voice and you're totally attending to it, and your life changes. So I think if you're only looking at the mystical unitive state, you're going to miss those kinds of signals. Yeah, so you can coach people to experience those kinds of states, or at least not to reject them, and to be able to handle them when they come up. Well, for example, as opposed to letting go, when you're in a tight spot, you can pray, for example. So that's a completely different way of interacting with a tight spot. So you'd have to learn how to pray. What is prayer, as opposed to what is letting go. So, so you'll learn to let go, or you'll learn to interact. You can do both, just depending. But I think one ought to have the option of being able to interact with the contents of these states. And also, you could develop an interactive relational questionnaire rather than a mystical experience questionnaire, and you can score high on that. Okay, so how did this happen? Well, it's always in vogue to blame Tim Leary, and I'm not immune from the syndrome. Tim was a Roman Catholic, turned his back on his religion, and he was really anti-Western religion. And he got, the Eastern religious bug big time. Went to India. Ram Dass went to India. And they wrote the Tibetan, or the, psychedelic, Book of the Dead, based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So they, kind of swallowed the Buddhist thing hook, line, and sinker. And they, promulgated it. They said, this is better than Christianity. This is better than Judaism. It's new. It's exotic. It, parallels the, the state that occurs with these drugs. But I think those conclusions were, based on not knowing, their own tradition that well. Alpert was, never really interested in Judaism. Tim Leary was never that interested in Christianity. And I think if, they had known more about what they were turning their back on, they may, not have, jumped on the Eastern bandwagon, to the extent that they did. And, it's a, common response when I speak about the Jewish, tradition, the prophetic tradition, is you have to contend with that tradition, which has been misused and abused for thousands of years. But still, that wouldn't necessarily preclude that there's some value that's contained in it. But Tim was out there in the '60s, and there was a lot of rebellion. And one of the things that it was easy to rebel against, were one's own spiritual traditions, and the Eastern ones were more new and exotic. And also, people really didn't know what they were getting into. As opposed to thinking that they knew what they were getting into, or turning their back on when it came to the Christian or the Jewish traditions. I think also one of the important pulls of Eastern religion was the conflict that was going on in the 1970s, and especially the massacres on the campuses of Kent State and Jackson State, which kind of flew in the face of the optimism and the utopia that you thought was possible or just around the corner, based on your psychedelic experiences. And obviously the Manson murders kind of quashed the concept of psychedelics being inherently good or like inherently beneficial. So as I think as a result of the conflict which occurred in the late '60s, early '70s, that people went to the East or turned to the East, because they wanted to withdraw. Like if there's no self in Buddhism, there's no outside world in Buddhism, then you can't be sad, you can't be depressed, you can't feel helpless. So I think a superficial understanding of the East, of the Eastern religions, kind of went, hand in glove with what was, necessary, or a, natural reaction to the, collision of, the idealism with, what was going on in the outside world. And, clearly, there were, shucksters and, people coming from the East, quite happy to, take on, disillusioned Western students. And I think as a result, it just became diffused within the culture. Like everybody, well, like if you go into a head shop, it's all Buddhas and, dorjes and bells and, mandalas, incense, and you'd wonder, about, why that has to be the case. Why aren't there, pictures of, Moses climbing Mount Sinai? Why aren't there, images of the Ten Commandments in stone? They're, just as, valid spiritual symbols, but for some reason it's, just kind of an automatic reflex to, turn to the East when you're looking at trying to understand or extract any spiritual material from the psychedelic state. And it's, filtered in, to the academic world, like it's, the mystical experience questionnaire as in contrast to the prophetic interactive relational questionnaire. Well, so hopefully, some young student out there will say, well, let's develop an interactive relational questionnaire. So, well, the only person, to date that's actually approached me is a Mormon psychiatrist. The Mormons really like scripture. So, he looked me up and we started, talking about it. So, hopefully, something will come of it. Okay, well, so what is the most important aspect of this work? Well, we start with the drugs, and it's not the drugs, it's the states of consciousness which they occasion. And, then again, it's really not the states of, consciousness, it's, what we learn in that state. And, what we learn impacts our relationships, for the better, hopefully, with ourselves and with the outside world. Okay, so those are my prepared remarks. Thank you.